Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Priscilla Andrews. I'm the clinical manager at the Cancer Wellness Center, and I would like to welcome everybody to this month's staff chat. The staff chat series was created as a way to give our community insight into conversations between professionals about issues and concerns relevant to the cancer community. And I am so pleased here to be joined by my pseudo co-host, Kim Matthews. I think this is like your fifth one.
I've lost count.
And to be accompanied as well by Zoë Goldstein, one of our doctoral students here, to talk about cancer and young women under 50 or below. Both Kim and Zoë are here because they both run young women groups here at the center. So thank you for being here today, ladies.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome. And actually, can I just say one thing?
Yeah.
Talking about young women, one question I get all the time from women when I talk to them about putting them in our, assigning them to our young women's support group. They're like, well, I'm 48, right? So it's what we'll touch on probably first thing, but the way we define young women is young for a cancer diagnosis and then at a very different life space than most of their peers or other patients. So.
And I'm glad that you pointed that out, because even though I just said women 50 and younger, I think what we see in the building too is kind of dependent on what's going on in a woman's life. They may be in their early to mid 50s and still very much relate to women in their 40s or even in their 30s, depending upon what's kind of going on with work and partnered relationship and children, etc. So I appreciate that disclaimer. So if you're not under 50, or even if you are, but you don't identify with the term young woman, you may still identify with what we're talking about here today. As I always do at the beginning of the staff chats is I like to just kind of turn it over to the two of you to just hear from you kind of what drew you to working with young women in particular.
So I started facilitating the young women's support group that I facilitate right now 22 years ago when I was a young woman. I don't know.
You'll always be a young woman to me, Kim.
So, at that time I could certainly relate. Fortunately, I didn't have a cancer diagnosis, but had just had my first child, could relate to a lot of the life space that a lot of the women in the group were at with young children, no longer being able to have children because of their cancer diagnosis, but maybe they had planned to have more children, maybe taking care of aging parents, probably still getting started in their career. So it was just a group of women that I could relate to from a life space and trying to support them as they were coping with the cancer diagnosis.
Yeah.
So that's what got me started in that decades ago.
Gotcha. They're related. It was relatable.
Exactly.
Yeah. What about for you, Zoë?
Well, still being a young woman myself, and this being my first year at the Cancer Wellness Center, I would definitely say that I feel that I relate to young women. And also, I just think that this can be a really underserved population and overlooked, just because when we think of someone who has cancer, we're often not thinking about this age demographic. And like both of you have said, all of the many different competing priorities and just everything that comes with this life stage. So I think it's been very meaningful for me to feel like I can be a part of creating a space that a lot of these women just don't have in their life and just don't see reflected around them. So that's been very fulfilling for me.
Yeah, it can be quite lonely to go to the chemo room and you're the youngest person there by 10, 20, 30 years.
Yes.
And maybe not being able to turn to the person next to you in the chair. Although in COVID, I know that's probably very different, but historically, not being able to turn to the person next to you in the chair and be able to relate to one another in a robust way that maybe some of our older population can do when they're in that environment.
Mm-hmm.
So, let's jump in, because I know, before we're here today, we talked about what are we going to talk about? And there's so much to possibly talk about here. So would love to just open it up to both of you to hear, what are kind of some of the aspects of the cancer experience that young women have that distinguish it from, other individuals going through a cancer diagnosis.
I want to touch on one more thing that I was just thinking about, because we're talking about young women today, but we also recognize just young adults in general as being a challenge, and always a challenging time to have a cancer diagnosis, but even more so. So we do also have a co-ed group for young adults, 20 to 40.
Ever the marketer, Kim.
I am. Because I get all these questions as people call.
Yeah.
To clarify. So, but the groups that Zoe and I facilitate are specifically for women with a cancer diagnosis up to 50. And I think part of the reason that we make that distinction and also have young women's groups is that there are a number of gynecologic cancers, whether it's breast cancer, ovarian cancer, uterine cancer, cervical cancer. That's not the total makeup of our women's groups, but often women with those diagnoses prefer to be in a group with other women rather than in a co-ed group.
Yeah, there might be some things and some things that are unique to being a woman or unique to being biologically a woman, might be unique to being biologically a woman, or might be unique to things that you have to cope with if you have a gynecologic cancer that may distinguish it from being in a co-ed group, for instance.
Right. And just they might be more comfortable talking with other women about sexuality, about losing their breasts, hysterectomies, issues that might be just less comfortable in a co-ed group.
And
go
ahead, Zoe.
No, I'm just thinking about being a young mom. I mean, every woman in our group is a mom, and I think that there's really a point of connection there, and that's something that they talk about with each other often.
Yeah. And I do want to just say, as we start this program, which is not something that I think we addressed when we were promoting it, is that I think there is much of the conversation that are likely going to have here that is going to address like a cisgendered female experience of cancer, and want to just acknowledge that as a trans woman, that is going to bring with it its own host of concerns and issues that will maybe in part be addressed here today, but may need to be its own staff chat another time to really fully explore and address kind of what can come up when you're in an environment that is very about your body, when that has been a evolving process, like I'm assuming for people who are transgendered and transitioned. So some of what we may talk about could translate to other people who are just young adults. When you are thinking about the women in your group and thinking about the things that they bring to the table, what are kind of some of the prevailing themes? What are some of the prevailing concerns that they're really having to wrestle with in light of a cancer diagnosis?
I think that oftentimes there's this feeling of separation from their peers. Like other moms and other women in their similar age group are kind of going on and doing their life that is expected at that time. And there's this feeling of kind of being taken out of that and plopped into a different trajectory, like we were saying earlier, that they don't see reflected in people who look like them. And so I think negotiating their old friendships and just what peer relationships are like now.
Yeah. And I think especially, I would think in particular for women who do have young children and may, if they're lucky enough, come out of an experience where they have been able to have that peer support and have people that really could identify and connect with what they're going through. I think that is often a struggle. Like even I hear a lot, like my friends, my family are really supportive, but they don't really get it.
Yeah. They're not really there.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about a young woman in particular who just is graduating out of my group. when she first called about interest in a support group, her whole focus was, is this a group of other moms? Do they have young kids? That's all that I really need. I need to know my kids are okay. I need to know how to take care of them. And I told her in this group, no, probably at that time when she joined, maybe half of the women had children and half did not. And she was a little reluctant. And I said, you'll see that sometimes we talk about children and how to support them and what their concerns are, but really the focus is on you. And she acknowledges now, as she's graduating out about a year and a half later, that she reluctantly joined the group thinking, this isn't really what I'm looking for, but if I can't find what I need. And she was all in. She was one of our biggest recruiters. She talked to other women, and she probably recruited half of the group that we have right now. And she said she remembered when I asked her about that initial conversation, she remembered that, reluctantly joined, and realized pretty quickly how much she was struggling with, what Zoe is saying, that she had a great support system of family and friends, but they couldn't support her as someone who really knew what she was experiencing. They supported her as somebody who loved her, who cared about her. They were struggling with their own emotions around her diagnosis.
Yeah.
And in the group, she could really address all of the various emotions she was experiencing, how it was to be a mom of young children and be frightened about, and sad about, will I be here when they have all their milestones in their life, or am I going to die too young and leave these children, right? She could talk very honestly about that in a group where her family and friends might say, oh, don't be silly. Your prognosis is good. You'll be fine. So I think very often when women have young children, that is a piece of what's going on for them, because that becomes such an important role and so much focus. Just like without a cancer diagnosis, women can lose sight of what they need to take care of themselves.
Well, yeah. Well, and I'm curious, because I think you're hitting on something, that this idea of identity and the identity of being a mom, and even thinking about what is it like as you're maybe have just transitioned to try to figure out how to be a mom, and this maybe even struggling with the balance of how much to give to your child versus self-care. And now all of a sudden, now you have to take care of yourself. Now you have to now there is this focus on you. I mean, I'm curious what each of yours experience, if that is something that's come up, of what it is to give yourself permission, or maybe I think something I've heard in the past is dealing with feelings of I'm being selfish or feeling guilty.
Yeah, that is definitely something that we hear a lot. When you're the mom who did absolutely everything totally oriented towards your kids, and then all of a sudden the roles sometimes have to be switched, where your kid actually needs to step up and do housework, or you need to take long naps during the day, and just generally feeling like your identity as a mom is now very different. And there can be some guilt in that. But I've also heard a lot of women say that they've actually been so impressed with their children, and that there's something that has drawn them closer with how their children have taken care of them during this time, and how they've learned to actually let that in. So that in a way has been transformative, even while it has also been difficult for these moms.
Interesting.
And I think it can be a challenge in a partnered relationship as well, because roles shift when there's a cancer diagnosis, whether it's spouse taking on more childcare roles, who's the breadwinner of the family. If it's the person with a cancer diagnosis, can they continue to work? Do they need time off while they're going through treatment? Who's responsible for household management? So there are so many aspects of those roles that just have to shift if somebody is going through prolonged treatment, or even if it is a surgery that they're recovering from. So that is a lot of what's discussed in the group, how to have those conversations. And unfortunately, sometimes those feelings of guilt, rocking the boat. It's just not fair to my family, right?
Yeah.
And I'm putting them through this. So we have a lot of those conversations.
Kind of these idealized notions of what it is to be a mom.
Mhm.
And I just want to make a comment about that idea of role negotiation, renegotiation is, something I find, and I'm curious what you guys have found is like, I think a lot of times people, they don't talk about that. We kind of fall into roles and there's not really communication around it. And so then, a woman shows up and is really struggling to figure out how to make things happen and how to get things in place. And then you say, well, have you talked to your partner about this? And it's like, no, because like they maybe have never really had to talk about it before.
Right. And sometimes the partner is very supportive and maybe they still don't have to talk about it. Partner just steps in. Sometimes the partner is not so supportive or also very overwhelmed because they're obviously dealing with the emotions around this too. So lots of our conversation in group is sometimes it becomes a joke sometimes in group with Kim asking yet again, have you had that conversation? As a therapist, we know the value of these conversations, even if it might be difficult and emotional. I always give them that disclaimer. But it is amazing how often those conversations don't happen. And I think for that reason you said, Priscilla, that we fall into these roles and it just kind of happens. And sometimes it's who were our role models and what did we learn from them, and we take on those maybe more stereotypical gender roles, or because one person is a breadwinner, the other one handles the household. So a lot of it is unspoken and you kind of fall into it. And now here comes a time where you actually have to ask for help or support, talk about what you need. And that can be really uncomfortable for people to acknowledge that they need help and can't do everything that they were able to do, not wanting to be a burden to somebody else, all kinds of reasons. There's a lot of emotion can come up around having those conversations.
And I would love to get your way. And I just want to capture something that Kim said just for a moment, because I think it's important to give voice to the fact that it isn't always the ideal situation, right? I think sometimes you have a supportive partner and sometimes you don't, right? And I think, I think that is even more so the need for support when you might have somebody who's willing to ask and it's just not there.
Right.
At a very complicated time of life, because maybe there's kids and maybe there's parents and maybe there's a career going on there all at the same time. So I didn't want to skip over that. But please, Zoe.
Yeah, and even just to add to that, I mean, sometimes you're single and that's a whole other thing. And being a single mom, of course, without cancer is incredibly difficult. And then you add that in, and what is that going to look like? And I also just wanted to say, with the importance of having these conversations, I think sometimes the partner isn't even aware of all of the things that the young mom is doing. And that because they can be unspoken, and when they just get done kind of without any conversation, it can kind of be under
just a magical little fairies take care of it all.
And the laundry just happens, these things just like invisible labor. And that's something that's very real in traditional domestic environments that we often are not aware of that it's happening, but it is happening.
All those little signs. There was a great SNL skit about the little signs with all the little quotes on them. I saw one that totally I thought of right now when you're talking, Zoe. Nobody notices what I do until it doesn't get done, right? For a traditional household where one person, traditionally the woman, takes care of all the household tasks, nobody else knows what happens behind the scenes until it doesn't happen. Cancer diagnosis, and she can't.
I remember years ago, I had a friend, she said that her partner was like, I just don't understand, like, where does all the hair go on the floor in the bathroom? I wipe it up. But I digress. I think, Zoe, you bring up another point here that I'd like to address here, which is we're talking about people who are partnered, but there are people who aren't in a relationship and may have children, or maybe they're not in a relationship and they don't have children. Curious what issues may be unique to that set of circumstances or those set of circumstances.
with any cancer diagnosis at any age, there's a lot of loss because there's all of this unexpected change that's not welcome, right? Sometimes it is loss of body parts. Sometimes it's loss of abilities. Sometimes it's loss of life, or certainly that sense of your mortality. So that loss of innocence about the future. When you don't yet have children or have started a family, but weren't done, cancer can get in the way as far as fertility. And so that is definitely an issue for young women in particular, since we're talking about women today. And then being single, do you want to be? Were you dating? How do you get back into that? That's a conversation that comes up often. When I start dating again, at what point do I disclose that I've had a cancer diagnosis? What if I want to get into a sexual relationship? At what point do I let them know that I've had a mastectomy and these are prostheses, or I've had reconstruction, or I've had a hysterectomy, or whatever it might be? When do I do that? So those conversations certainly happen in counseling and in groups with young women who are single. A number of women, I have 2 or 3 in my group right now who are divorced or going through a divorce. And that is a challenging time of life. And then you add a cancer diagnosis in, and maybe thinking about dating at some point in the future. So I think the biggest pieces are the relationship when you're single, if you want to be in a relationship, at what point, what does that look like? How do you even get comfortable with that again? And issues of fertility.
And also, just to add to the fertility piece, I know this is very surprising, but oftentimes healthcare providers don't actually bring up issues of fertility. And it can be, time sensitive. There's a pressure to begin treatment very quickly. There's a lot of anxiety, understandably. And so that very important piece of quality of life can fall away, especially if the person is not currently thinking about having kids. And then there's so much grief associated with it if, it's now 7 years later, and then this person does want to have children. So I really would just say advocating for yourself in bringing up those conversations if your healthcare provider has not already spoken about it with you.
Sure. Like, what kinds of options can I do? Egg harvesting? Like, how much time do I have? How time sensitive is starting this treatment?
Yeah. And those may be patient-led conversations.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think, thinking of another conversation that, my understanding, research shows like 85% of doctors don't talk about sexual health.
Yes.
And yet here, oftentimes we're dealing with women who may have cancers that very much directly impact their body esteem or their sexual functioning.
And we're talking about, we've mentioned gynecologic cancers, breast cancer, but I would argue every cancer impacts body esteem and sexuality, libido, vaginal dryness, erectile dysfunction. I mean, all kinds of issues related to the cancer or the treatment. And sadly, also has to be all too often, a patient-driven conversation.
I'm curious. Oh, sorry. I'm just like, after Kim talks, I'm so used to talking to her on these. I'm like, Kim, go ahead, Zoe.
I was just going to say that, a lot of women can actually be very surprised by issues with sexual functioning and their sexual well-being, and thinking that it's just them, that it's something going on that they had no idea was going to happen. And so I guess I just want to say that it is so incredibly common. I just want to reinforce that again, and that it's something to bring up. If you have a therapist, to bring up with your therapist, and then also with your healthcare provider, just to be as aware as possible of resources.
And the fact that if your doctor isn't bringing up doesn't mean it's not an issue. Right. I'm curious if you find that it comes up in group, or if people tend to be a little bit more hesitant to discuss that openly, or maybe because it's all women, that maybe makes it easier to talk about issues related to sexual health.
I think it depends on who the people are. So I've facilitated co-ed groups also. And I find that in same gender groups, it tends to be an easier conversation, but it still depends, because you can have somebody bring it up and you can see half the people really eager to have the other conversation and other half like, oh no, we're not gonna, like, silence. So it for some people it's very comfortable, for some people it's not, but they want to have the conversation, so they'll push themselves to do it, and some are like, yeah, that's a private thing, not doing that in a group.
Yeah.
And either way it's okay. I think we'll still have those conversations in the group. We're certainly not going to push everybody to participate, but it's good for them to hear that, to normalize it, and to know there are resources available to them.
Yeah.
What's your experience in a group, Zoe?
I think we often have more conversations about body image than sexual well-being, I think. And I'm just thinking about times where women have kind of said, can I even show you how, my reconstruction has been going? And that has been something that has really been welcoming, and it has created, I think, and this is a female only group, just this kind of warm, supportive female space. But there is definitely this sense of just making sure that the other women will be receptive to this before kind of opening up that part of themselves.
Yeah. I mean, and I think it speaks to how I think there are often issues. I mean, I think across the board, but in particular, as we're thinking about younger people with cancer, that it is harder to talk about, right? I mean, even in a group where it's a support group, there's a professional there, you're with other women that have cancer, that there can sometimes be hesitancy to talk about things that are like common experiences related to having a cancer diagnosis. I know this is shifting gears, that I didn't want to not touch on work, because I think that is also an element that, especially with our older population, lots of times they're retired, or, their career was kind of already winding down. Whereas oftentimes these are women that are in like the generative phase of their career. So you tell me, what do you see? What are the concerns? How do people cope with that?
Do you want to start, Zoe? Do you want me to start?
I guess I can just start with saying that I've heard a lot from women that because their priorities have shifted so much, even if they do love their jobs, there can definitely be this sense of, I only care about the really significant things. So I mostly care about my family, and I mostly care about my own well-being. And I care about the parts of my job that I like, but I'm not working overtime. I'm not dealing with work drama anymore, and I'm taking breaks for myself. And so even though, of course, it's so difficult to work with a cancer diagnosis and in survivorship, I have seen almost this wonderful reprioritizing that happens, like a shaking out of all the unnecessary elements. That has been really cool to see.
And I know in your group, a number of women actually have changed jobs or careers, even while they're in treatment, or some post-treatment. So I think that speaks to the reevaluation. Is this what I'm still interested in? I would say in my groups, it's usually for the women who have a career outside of their home, probably about 50% continue working during treatment, and the other half don't. And either way, there are significant challenges that they work through. The fatigue level, time off for appointments. Does everybody, all of their coworkers or their clients, do they know? Do they keep it from some people? Is this a kind of career where they don't let their clients know? Or a big company where only the people who need to know? So that communication in the workplace is definitely an issue. For those who stop working during treatment, going back to work, how do they explain their absence? Who already knows? What kind of conversations are they having? What do they want people to know? So just negotiating that. And usually when people go back to work, they're still dealing with some probably significant fatigue, maybe some chemo brain, which can impact ability to multitask, memory issues. So they go back usually not feeling at their full capacity. So that impacts their confidence, potentially going back as well. So Do they go right back in full time? Are they able to ease in? Do they have supportive boss or HR department or team? So all kinds of factors when you're talking about careers during cancer. There are some great websites. If you just research or do a Google search, careers in cancer, you'll find some.
Yeah. And there is one called cancerandcareers.org that has lots of resources and webinars. I often refer there, and as you guys were talking, I was reminded of, a client that I had that was the primary breadwinner, and obviously even more important because she carried the insurance for the family. I think when I hear that a lot, I can't lose my job because this is how I'm getting care. And really struggling with, the demands of the workplace that have a certain culture. She was in a upper management position that were not conducive to the boundaries she was trying to put in place, not conducive to, trying to implement better self-care, and feeling stuck, right? Like I'm caught between a rock and a hard place because I can't lose this job. But I think oftentimes, and I think this is maybe a more universal experience, is that desire to better manage stress. I think there's often a lot of worry of I think there's some magical thinking of if I'm going to cause my cancer, or I caused my cancer. That then gets very complicated if you're trying to juggle lots of different things, including a workplace that is, and maybe it's not even that the workplace would define themselves as unsupportive, but that there is this sort of expectation around performance that is not as reasonable as it once was.
Absolutely. And we're talking right now about women who have a career sometimes as the primary breadwinner, even if they're not the primary breadwinner and insurance holder, in their career, their job is impacted. Also, if they are partnered, likely their spouse has a career. And what does that look like? Is it a career where they travel a lot? Are they the insurance holder? And so they still need to do that. So those kinds of challenges are things that we discuss too, like how much leeway is there in your spouse being able to be more available and supportive to you, given the roles and demands that they have.
Yeah, it can impact it from either side. I mean, I will say, I think there is, to make a little social commentary, I do think that there is an added burden for women who are in a more male-dominated field of there being less forgiveness around any sign of weakness, whether that is in reality or a sense of this is how I have to present in order to succeed, that I think makes that, more challenging. I mean, even to, I think, ask for allowances or to pursue, because cancer is covered under the ADA. So if you make your employer aware of that, then they have to make reasonable accommodations. But I think many of the women I've worked with, for multiple reasons, are hesitant to lean on that because they don't want to be perceived as anything other than competent.
Yeah, I definitely see that a lot. And also, even though it is covered under the ADA, there are a lot of employers who are really not understanding. And that can just be so difficult to advocate for yourself, especially if you need to keep your job. Yeah. And so a lot of women just can get stuck in that position while also needing to be agreeable because that's how they've been socialized.
Yeah. Yeah. I was just thinking about, I worked with a woman once who had been an executive at a very well-known company in the area, and was on a leave. And her struggle was, I'd spent so much time on my career. I'd even went back after I had children. And now I don't know how important that is to me, which I think we can think of wow, so great. You're figuring out your priorities, but there's such a struggle of what it was to think about making a pivot or even just walking away, because it was sort of saying, I don't know that this is my top priority and where I want to put my energy. But it's not an easy process in either direction, whether you want to be back in your career or you're thinking about stepping back from it.
And this has to do with the identity piece again of what do I care about now that I've gone through this unthinkable experience, and who am I, and what are my relationships? Again, what are my priorities? And even if it could ultimately be beneficial for the person, that whole growth process, there are huge growing pains having to do with identity changes like that.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that goes beyond just the career aspect of it, right? That sense of identity, who am I kind of reevaluation, because how do you see that coming up in other areas of life with the women that you work with, Zoe?
I'm just thinking about, I really am thinking about the work piece of, I used to be, and also just the doer piece of, I used to be so busy, so capable, kind of in this way of getting everything done for everyone, for myself, for my kids, for my husband, and at work. And now all of a sudden, maybe I'm not all of those things, and maybe that's okay. Like maybe I am still a whole person. And just what does that look like to have an identity that is in large part maybe more about self-care and stillness? It's just a complete reimagining, I think, of the way women usually see their identities.
Well, and I think that speaks to their own sense of value. I think I see that, like, if I'm not balancing all of these plates, then what is my worth, and how am I going to be maybe evaluate's not the right word, but how am I going to be perceived if I can't keep doing all of this?
Absolutely.
And there can be some truth in that. How will I be perceived? Because maybe who they want to be now, who they are more comfortable being, the shifts they want to make, might not be welcomed by partners. I've seen it not always welcomed by children, employers. So, reconciling all of that, how important is these shifts that you're making, and how committed are you to doing that? And what conversations do you have with people close to you about shifts that are being made?
Yeah, which I think can be in particular difficult, because I don't know about you guys, but I find most of the women that I work with have a strong people pleaser aspect of them.
Yes.
So the idea of creating conflict, of having somebody be unhappy with them, it's very hard for them oftentimes to be centered on this is what needs to happen, or this is what's right for me. That's a very difficult space to stay grounded in.
And often people around the person who has the diagnosis can't wait until treatment's over so things can go back to normal. Men are going to be back to normal. And it's one reason that women tend to stay in a support group for usually at least a year post-treatment, if not longer. And some don't even join a group until after treatment, when they're recognizing this dynamic of, I'm a different person. Things are changing. They're going to be forever changed. Some, I might not like some of those changes, but it's a reality. Some of the changes I like, nobody else seems to be on board with that. So that can be
I think it's more typical for there to be a little bit pushback rather than like the kumbaya moment. We could get to the kumbaya moment, but normally there's a little like, whoa, 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 whoa. I was reminded, I was working with a woman, and, she had very successful treatment. The cancer was all clear, and had like a preteen son, and said, hey, all clear, like great, hopeful news, right? Wants to share that. And what got communicated to the son is, well, mom's all done and mom is all better. And so I don't need to be helping as much around the house. I don't need to be as ginger with mom as I was. And there needing to be some more communication and explanation of what exactly that means. Because he cared about his mom. It wasn't like he was like, yeah, but like just not being able to conceptualize that this is an evolving process and I am still healing. And I'm talking about a preteen son, but I think you guys would agree. We can see that with any age group.
Yes.
Because it's what people want, right? They long for those pre-cancer days. And often the patient does too, but they just recognize that isn't going to be a reality anymore.
Yeah. So I'm looking at the time, and I almost hesitated to bring this up, but I feel like it would be a disservice if we did not at least touch on it momentarily, because I think there is this aspect that we haven't named directly, which is young women and this would extend to young adults, having to face their mortality in a way that their peers have not.
Right.
Yeah.
That's where I feel like groups can be so helpful. Certainly, we always work with young people who in counseling too, and can work through some of those, that reality of being faced with their mortality. And that happens even if the prognosis is phenomenal, even if this is an early stage diagnosis.
Yeah.
You get a cancer diagnosis, you think about your death. And so it's in a group, I think that opportunity to normalize that, to talk about it, to be honest about how scary it might be, how you, maybe some of these life changes that we've been talking about are because I don't know, will this cancer come back? I don't know how long my life is going to be. Maybe I don't want to wait 30 years to do some of the things that I might be able to do now, because what if I'm not here in 30 years?
Yeah.
And it isn't dependent on your prognosis. It really is, you've had this cancer diagnosis. It's pretty common to be faced with your mortality.
Yeah.
And also oftentimes women feel like they can't talk about it with their family members because their family members will react poorly, or they have to take care of their emotions. And so they have to kind of cordon off or hide this part of themselves that they are actually struggling with. And so in group, we just see that coming to the surface where they can be brutally honest about what they're experiencing, and that it's okay and completely normal, like you're saying, Kim, to have these thoughts and fears.
Yeah. Well, I think there's such a knee-jerk reaction oftentimes to just provide reassurance as a way to help the person cope. But that sometimes for some people that works.
Yeah.
Sometimes. And then a lot of times we just need to talk it through and have it acknowledged, I think.
And I think that knee-jerk reaction, when it's coming from somebody who loves the person, is their own. They likely have also now been faced with the reality of mortality, and it's uncomfortable. And they'd rather not. Now, and that's not universal. Some people, they're able to have those honest conversations with the people close to them, and everybody can acknowledge how scary it is and support one another through that. But very often it is a preference to, let's focus on the good. Let's focus on the good prognosis, and you're doing well, because that's more comfortable. And that's not a bad thing. That can be
in and of itself.
But right, also having the opportunity to acknowledge all of the emotions that are coming out.
It's like improv, yes and.
Yes.
Well, what I can say though is I just looked at the clock. I always get to 1 o'clock and I'm like, where did that time go?
Yeah.
So I want to just thank you both for being here today. Do you want to give a little plug for the Young Women's Group before we go here?
Sure. So Young Women's Group, if we have any young men watching, Young Adults Group also, just call our center, intake line 847-562-4981. Did I get that?
Very good. I'm impressed.
Wow, that was cool.
And whomever you speak with will point you in the right direction, talk to you about our group options, counseling options. We definitely see a lot of young people at the Cancer Wellness Center.
And Sabina was kind enough to mention that it happens that tomorrow at 11:30 a.m. we are having a presentation on fertility. So if you could identify with that today, then go on our website and check out the calendar so that you can register for that program. So I want to thank Zoe and Kim for being here this month. I will be back here next month, as Salt and Pepper say. Let's talk about sex. I'll be joined by Jennifer Littner, a sex therapist, to talk about sexuality and the cancer experience. So hopefully you will be able to join us on June 8th at 12:30 p.m. Thanks, Kim and Zoe, and thanks everybody for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.